Bad trips. They're certainly easier to do in a movie than good trips. I didn't see Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, but everyone said it proves again that it's very easy to portray a bad trip and very hard to portray a good trip. Well, first of all, I'll say all the conventional things about bad trips. That, it's not always supposed to be easy, that sometimes learning curves feel very unpleasant when they're unfolding, and we learn from our mistakes and so forth and so on. So then, having said all that, really, what about bad trips? Well, they're horrible. Bad trips make bad sex look like no problem, which is an amazing thing to achieve. I don't know. I guess part of the fun or part of the challenge of being psychedelic people is that our method, which is drop and wait, you never know. You may think and you may do your Rolfing and your go to Gestalt and just be scrubbed and drained and shined with all your enzyme systems up and going, and it can still just chew your ass unmercifully. It's one of those places where who am not necessarily that eager for astrological explanations, reach eagerly for astrological explanations. Because if everything else is right, and I've even noticed, Moon in Scorpio for me is not a good time to do psychedelics. I before a large trip, I will throw the I Ching. And without spending too much time on the I Ching, I can't remember which hexagram it is, but one of the 64 hexagrams says, inquire again of the oracle if you have constancy, something else. And almost invariably, I have no idea how many times in my life contemplating psychedelic trips I've thrown that hexagram, the hexagram which says ask again. And so then I ask again, and if it's negative, I don't do it. I figure you have right brain tools and left brain tools. Somehow this question about bad trips is about your pre-trip intuition, feeling into the situation. And then, of course, there are obvious rules. There are guaranteed situations which give you bad trips. I mean, taking too much of a drug with people you don't know, taking large amounts of a drug and mixing it with a lot of moving around in crowded social spaces. Um, synergies synergies are simply combinations of drugs. Somebody tells you they took ecstasy and then they snorted some ketamine and then they had a little nitrous oxide and some GHB. This is, God knows, literally only God knows, because no clinical medical research is ever done on stuff like that. On the way people in the street actually take drugs is never studied by medical science. And synergies are where the strange things, dangerous stuff happens, the heart fibrillations, the convulsions, the convulsive vomiting, the states of disorientation, prolonged states of sleeplessness, all of these things. My attitude toward avoiding bad trips is, for social purposes, raves and beach parties and whatever, low doses. It's almost a true, or it is a truism that if you want to come down from a drug, whether a psychedelic drug or any other drug, the very best thing to do is furious exercise. The guy who throws himself in the icy lake and swims across it, the guy who chops 2 cords of wood to come off some bender. Well, then a dance club is almost like the perfect social situation designed to shorten a drug trip and dampen the effects. But people are such social creatures. I've said in many, many times over the years to the point where it's almost the McKenna method, although how you could think something so simple-minded was a method, was a way to take psilocybin, for example, is take a stiff hit, 5 grams if you're a 145-pound person, on an empty stomach and lie still in silent darkness. Well, this is almost the opposite of, and the idea is you don't want, you want to concentrate on the thing itself, which is the drug projected against the black screen of your mind. You don't need doof coming in. You don't need smart drugs. All of these things are actually distraction. And I think people don't are so reluctant to follow this advice because they actually have no faith in the drug. They think they will be bored. They think, well, if I did that, nothing would happen. Well, I'm telling you, it's for ordinary people. Isn't that what we said? This stuff is not for the swamis. They have their own methods. This is for the great unwashed masses of spiritually seeking humanity. So lay down in silent darkness and take a look. Uh, and then if the trip is really bad, then there are things you can do while it's happening that are helpful. The most obvious one is, or the most effective, I don't know if it's the most obvious, but I really believe it's the most effective, is if you get into a place that you don't like, and it's not physiological. It's not that you're having convulsions or vomiting. It's just that you're having thoughts which alarm you. You should sing. You can make whatever shamanic hash of this you wish, but the basic concept is to oxygenate your brain. There's something about bad states of mind on psychedelics are very frequently, in my observation, accompanied by shallow breathing. People get, when you thread a needle, everybody holds their breath. Nobody can thread a needle without holding their breath. It's like keeping your eyes open while you sneeze. A human being cannot do this. So when we are really following our thought at the level of threading a needle, we stop breathing. And if you're not paying attention, this can go on for minutes. This very shallow breathing. You're not breathing, dude. And so the thing to do is to sit up and your favorite shamanic chant, Fleetwood Mac recitation, or whatever, just belt it out. It doesn't really matter. It may matter if you choose certain mantras or something. Haystacks will burst into flame, and there's no obligation to be au courant or hip either. It doesn't have to be Aphex Twins. It can be row, row, row your boat. I've always preferred, because it does contain the refrain, merrily, 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 life is but a dream. If you're loaded on psilocybin or ayahuasca, the thought that life is but a dream opens ahead of you and becomes epiphanous instead of ridiculous. Uh, and then, I don't know, this is what I do. This is maybe not universally good advice, but when I take psychedelics like that, I have bombers rolled, and and uh, and if things get weird, I torch them up. Although sometimes then things get weirder. You have to be careful with that. I mean, the way I do it, and I've really got this down, sort of, is with psilocybin anyway. People say it comes on in 10 minutes, it comes on in 20 minutes, and they're ripping in 40 minutes. It doesn't work like that for me. It consistently, and I always take it not in tea or anything, but just the mushroom. I eat it. At the hour and 10-minute mark, it begins to come on, I guess. I mean, there's feeling of nausea and maybe coldness, and there's just like a certain window of opportunity where then if you smoke cannabis, it immediately begins the hallucinations very dramatically and moves you quickly through that clammy handshaking part of the trip, which is sometimes alarming. Most of my experience with cannabis, it's improved. If a trip was weird, it got better with cannabis. I have had, many experiences where it was so strong the thought of smoking a joint was just like, no, I don't think so. We take this as given here. We don't need to amp it up or push it sideways. But nobody does this a lot who doesn't then occasionally put in a very difficult evening. And, part of your psychic, I guess your shamanic constitution is how quickly can you come back from a really bone shaking psychedelic experience, either because it blew your mind in some way or something appalling happened. I mean, I remember a number of psychedelic trips that were hard to come back from, but I remember one in particular years ago where my friend and I took a lot of acid, and late in the trip, like about 3:30 in the morning, he had a very dramatic epileptic seizure, and I had never seen an epileptic seizure. And oh God, it just set off this cascade of hysterical activity. The 911 people had to be called. I remember there was a real moment of truth in all this for me. I remember the apartment was on the second floor, and I saw the cop cars and everything pull up in front. We had flushed staggering amounts of dope, knowing that they were about to arrive, and I went tearing down to the front door, and I was completely loaded on acid. I could barely stand, and I could see through the glass the cop. And he said, open the door. We had locked the door earlier in the evening. He said, open the door. So I fumbled with the door for a few seconds, completely hysterically and ineffectively. And then I couldn't get the door open. So I stepped back from the door and said, shut the lock off. And then I realized, dude, get a grip. You're going to have to. This is headed in the wrong direction. And the clock was like. So then, and then I remember, this trip to the hospital, and I don't know what was going on. It was Herrick Hospital. It was in Berkeley, which was also a mental hospital. This bed, me standing at the end of the bed, trying to figure out, is he dead? Is he alive? What does this mean? Who am I? What's going on? And then there was a person who was obviously an inmate of the stranger wards of this mental hospital, who was washing the floor with this big mop and sort of waltzing around us with this crazy expression and leaning over and looking at me and looking at him. And I just didn't know whether, is this really happening? And if it is happening, why is it happening? And if it isn't happening, why do I think this is what's happening? And then finally, the doctors threw me out of there, and I just walked the streets of Berkeley for hours, and my mind was like spinning, just saying, something terrible has happened. Something terrible, terrible, terrible has happened. And it took days to realize, yes, he had an epileptic fit. Here's what an epileptic seizure is. Here's the drug. Here's the prognosis. Here he is, seemingly all right. He came through it in much better shape, it seemed, than I did. I was deeply spun by all of this crazy shit. And that's not an out of control drug story. Truly, I'm a very conservative person. So for me, that was an evening really getting beyond management. But some people, start out like that. I had friends in the 60s in New York City who would say, in Manhattan, they would say, let's take 500 mics and hit the streets and mess with people's minds. Well, and you quickly discover there are people out there capable of messing with your mind and more than your mind, and that sitting up all night in Manhattan diners just taking on all comers for mind games is, no way to. Anyway, so much for the question. What do you do about bad trips? If you have character, you live through them, and after a few months, go back to it. Many people, it's a bad trip that finishes them for psychedelics. And I don't think, you're ever really immune to it. The funny thing about psychedelics, I think, especially psilocybin, I've noticed, is it's incredibly gentle with beginners. It almost never bites a beginner, these clueless people who go to it with knees knocking. Usually, the doors of heaven open and they're swept in. It's the veterans, it's the old battle scarred explorers who, come back from a certain given evening with their eyes bugging and a tale to tell.
And I primarily from Stan that there is no such thing as a bad trip. There is the wrong context, which is what you were saying in the story. That if you follow he's like you, he thinks eye shades and, shut out the world. And so you meet the demons and you go through the doors of hell and you're in the belly of the whale and all of those other things, which is your ego slamming around, and you'll come out of that with information. And hopefully, well, if you really let yourself go down that far, the doors of heaven will open too. And then one begins to dance between those two spaces.
Yeah, the only place where I really think the concept bad trip is legitimate and is true in my experience as well as my opinion is when you mess with the actual physical substances in some way. In other words, if you take pure psilocybin, pure LSD, well-made ayahuasca, there is no such thing as a bad trip. It will teach you. It may put you through hell. It may change your personality, but it's useful. Where it gets chancy is if you are physiologically compromised in some way. For example, and this is kind of controversial, so it's worth talking about, but in my opinion, it's a very bad idea to combine psilocybin with an MAO inhibitor. But people I respect, as much as I respect anybody, do this in their therapy. And so I've looked at this hard because the worst drug experience I ever had revolved around this combination. And I think my mistake, I did it differently than these people who use it therapeutically. As I understand it, the way they're doing it is they're inhibiting their MAO with, say, Pagaman Harmala, and then they're taking a little bit of psilocybin. I have no judgment on that because I've not done it. What I did once years ago, to my immense regret, was I took half a dose of mushrooms, 2.5 grams of mushrooms, and half a dose of ayahuasca, 50 milliliters of ayahuasca. And I put in a long, strange evening that felt dangerous to me. I mean, we only have my account, but um, something went on in that trip that I've never seen in any other trip, and I can describe it for you, and I even can have an analysis of it, but I'm not sure that the analysis is true. What happened was the trip seemed normal for the first hour or so. And then in the part of the trip where I should have been smoothly hallucinating, roving and scanning, taking in data and learning, I noticed a rising anxiety that I couldn't control. And the anxiety was, it was a generalized anxiety. It was a feeling, a strong feeling that something was wrong. And so then I would like stop my trip was and deal with this feeling that something is wrong. And I would look around and reassure myself, nothing is wrong. Heartbeat okay. You're sitting in the chair, moonlight is flooding in, the cat is at your feet. Nothing is wrong. So go back to tripping. 30 seconds later, something is wrong. And I would come out of it after about 4 or 5 times of this, and the loop was getting faster and shorter. I could, even on the trip, I analyzed what was going on. What was going on was no short term memory was happening at all. I knew who I was. I could tell you my parents' story and so forth and so on. What I had lost was the last 30 seconds of my life didn't exist. And this may not sound like a problem, but in fact, it's like having your big toes cut off or something. You can't stand anymore. The absence of the last 30 seconds creates this bizarre sense of a vertiginous void behind you, and you keep looking around, and then it's there. You say, oh, well, it is there. And now I feel like it's not there. Oh, yes, it's there. Well, this is crazy making, and it may not sound, so agonizing, but I found it to be as close to madness as anything I've ever experienced. And I felt at times that they'll just find me here, just gibbering. They'll just, throw a light net over me and take me by the elbow and lead me away, and that'll be it. Uh, and then finally, and I had this very overlaying this thing was this very strong image from Stanley Kubrick's film 2001, where the guy is outside the spaceship in the little robot, and he fixes the thing, and then it's time to go back in, and he speaks to the main robot controlling the spaceship, and he says, "Open the pod doors, Hal." And the robot says, "I'm sorry, Dave, I can't do that." He says, "Open the pod doors, Hal." "I'm sorry, Dave, I can't do that." And I could almost see in my mind's eye, maybe because I think to some degree in a chemical fashion or something, but I could see that a piece of machinery was jammed,
Mm.
that we were in a loop, that it would not, it was screwed up at the molecular level. And I felt crazy. I felt violent. And my wife was sleeping upstairs. Finn was tiny. Clea hadn't been born. And I felt absolutely irrationally violent toward everybody and everything because of this odd collapse of my sensorium. And so then I said to myself, I will not leave this chair till this releases me. I just will sit here. Now, that might have been a bad decision. In other words, I could have gone out and chopped wood, but I don't think that was the moment to pick up the double-bladed axe. And so I sat there and I deep breathed and I did every trick I knew. And after about an hour and a half, it could see it rotate around, decouple, drift away. And then it was like, oh, the trip begins again. It feels like a normal trip. We're right back where we were an hour ago, and everything is normal. And, but I broke my own rule. It was an experiment. Yeah, it was an experimental combination. And it's not necessary. I mean, don't get the idea that you have to take every drug that comes down the pike so that when people mention 2CBT2 and all this, you have a story to tell. Psilocybin, LSD, mescaline, and ayahuasca, a little DMT now and then, it'll do you. That's it. You can spend 1,000 lifetimes exploring those substances and to never have a dull moment. Uh, what? A little dab will do you, indeed.
I It seems to me that nothing is good in combination with something that is an MAO inhibitor. It should be that should it's not just psilocybin.
What? Give me another example. You mean like
Hey,
Pagaman Harmala and DMT?
I don't know enough chemistry, but what I know about MAO inhibitors, combining it, I know somebody here recently was on an MAO inhibitor, a prescription one, and took ecstasy and went into cardiac arrest and died. Not from the cardiac arrest, but from passing out and what happened as a result of passing out. It didn't, and then nobody knew, and so death occurred.
Well, that's an extreme example. It shows you, it exactly makes the point I made earlier that these synergies are completely unstudied. And that's a simple synergy. Ecstasy with a prescription MAO inhibitor. If this person had also, added in a little ketamine and some GHB, and as people do, I mean, have told me appalling story recitations of the drugs they took the night before. Uh, this MAO thing is sensitive enough that if you are on certain MAO inhibitors, you don't need to take a drug to bring on a hypertensive crisis. You can just drink a glass of red wine or eat camembert cheese or abuse a Hershey bar or eat a big bowl of lentil soup. Who would dream that a bowl of lentil soup could send you over the edge? Uh, yeah, it pays to do your homework, and then it pays to, I think if you're getting good mileage from a particular psychedelic, you should just stick with it. You can always switch to something else, but you know, and people say, well, I've learned all I need to learn from this. Well, triple the dose and it'll be a different horse you ride. And I say that, within the knowledge that the LD50 of these compounds is very high. In other words, they're incredibly safe of all drugs, the plant psychedelics, the alkaloid psychedelics, are the safest, and yet their effects are the most dramatic. In other words, the LD50 for psilocybin is milligrams per kilogram. Well, but the effective dose for a 135-pound person is 20 milligrams. Well, then that means that from a pharmacologist's point of view, if you told him you'd taken 100 milligrams, he would form no sense of alarm. He would say, well, you took a big dose. It's really going to get you high. But he wouldn't worry about your heartbeat or anything like that. To kill yourself with psilocybin, you would have to eat a massive amount. When people say, well, but you think you're going to die. Well, that's an entanglement of ego image with body image. And, when the ego is very fragile, I mean, you just shoot 100 milliliters of ketamine and the ego is dissolving before your very eyes. And that's not a intrusive dose of a drug. The ego is fragile. The body is not. The ego plays the ace. You're dying, but you're not dying. The ego is dying. If you've not trained medically, and I'm not, it's extremely alarming to have somebody become unconscious in your presence and not be able to rouse them. I've talked to a number of times to friends of mine who are professional ER emergency room doctors, and they say no big deal, happens all the time. And if somebody can claim they're dying, they certainly are not dying. And if they're hysterical that they're dying, they certainly can't be anywhere near dead.